I believe we have some an Albanian delegation here. Armenian, sorry. So I'll try and speak slowly so the Russian translator can keep up. So my talk today is going to be about mineral asset valuation. It's really a critical part of the mining industry. It doesn't really matter whether you're Anglo-American or you're a junior exploration company. It really underpins any decision that you'll make in terms of investment on your project. So understanding the value of your mineral asset is absolutely fundamental to our industry. My name is Johan Bradley. I'm a geologist by training. I'm the managing director of SRK's offices in Sweden and Finland. I'm going to tell you a bit about the different types of valuation techniques, how those are applied in the different project stages, and also give you an idea of what you should look for if somebody puts an asset in front of you and tells you this thing is worth X million dollars. I've tried to split this into 10 things to know. So there's 10 slides, all with a few key points on. And I think one of the most important things is to understand that although it's a bit of a black art valuation, there are some well-established codes, international reporting codes, that govern how you should report valuations for mineral assets. And some of those names you might recognize from the major stock exchanges in the world that support mining transactions. You've got Simbal from Canada, Valmin from Australia, and Samval from South Africa. And all those codes are actually pretty similar. It's really about trying to align the reporting guidelines for mineral asset valuation. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is get to a point where the investor feels confident and comfortable with the valuation, and the three principles of materiality, transparency, and the competency are covered off. One of the important parts about a valuation is really a valuation range. You should always be skeptical, unless you've got a very advanced asset, that the project only has a single number. Particularly for earlier stage assets, the idea is to come up with a reasonable range of values that reflects somewhere between what the market would say. And I suppose as a valuator, what you're trying to do is find a number that another valuator would come to looking at the assets in the same way. That's an important point. If you do see a range, particularly on early stage asset, make sure you get a plus minus number. Your Russia translators chatting away there. There's actually two types of value. If you're going to define value, there's essentially what they call a fair market value, and then the underlying technical value. The definition of a fair market value, which you may be familiar with, is a valuation that's prepared in an open and unrestricted market where you have a willing buyer and a willing seller, and it's at an arm's length transaction, which means essentially that you have there's no vested interest, there's no relationship between the buyer and the seller. And a technical value is really the underlying value behind the market value. I guess the easiest way to visualize that is when you have if you're going to buy a house, the estate agent would value the property at a certain price. The property would then go to market, and the market value, so that the final value of the transaction may actually differ from the the estate agent's value. And that's essentially the difference between the two. Point 4, the development stage of the property, that's really the key driver in terms of defining a valuation approach. If you can imagine the two extreme scenarios where you have project A being a very early stage exploration asset against project B, which is an asset that's already in production, that's in operation. So how do you tackle those two extremes? Well, there's several different methods, and the application of the method and the selection of that method is really dependent on how much data you have for the asset and how well developed that asset is, which I'll get onto now. So there are point 5, the valuation approaches, 3 valuation approaches which are widely accepted in the industry. You have something called a cost-based approach, a market-based approach, and an income-based approach. You're probably most familiar with, if I come back to the analogy of the property market, that is very much based on the market method, where you have lots of comparable transactions in the same area, and it's very easy essentially to find a large number of comparable properties from which to base a valuation on. It's not as easy in the exploration and mining industry to do that, so we look at other approaches as well. Probably the most widely recognized is the income-based approach, which you'll get all your standard key indicators from, like NPV, IRR, payback period, reserve tail, debt cover ratio, and that's the income-based approach. All those methods are actually about getting a value for the property. And as a valuer, you typically try and use as many of those approaches as you can and different methods to try and limit the subjectivity of the valuation and come to something that is reasonable and transparent. So the cost-based approach, essentially, if you really boil it down to the nuts and bolts of it, is you take your meaningful past exploration expenditure and you add to that the expenditure you need to reach the next decision point. This is probably the method that requires the most experience, because getting a value on exploration properties at a very early stage is not easy. The range can be huge. But this is probably the most useful method when you're looking at early stage exploration assets. The tricky part is understanding how much of the exploration expenditure has actually been useful, how much of the exploration expenditure has actually been well spent in advancing the knowledge of the property. And the key question is, well, has it actually advanced, has it made the property more attractive, or has it killed the property completely? So the cost-based method, that's what you would use for early stage exploration assets. With a market-based approach, the analogy is if we go back to the estate agent again, you use the value of other properties as a proxy for the property you're looking at. Essentially, you try and find as many comparable properties you can and derive a value from those properties. The good thing is it can be applied to any project at any development stage. the real challenge in the exploration industry is that finding a comparable project is almost impossible. You always have to compromise on certain areas, which ultimately leads to a pretty shallow pool of comparable properties. Otherwise, it's a very useful technique. And the income-based approach is what you're probably most used to hearing about in the mining industry, and it's applied to any project really where you have a reserve estimate. You can also apply it to, they've relaxed the reporting regulations in certain jurisdictions, like in Canada you have something called a PEA. There's a bit of a grey area, I think, in Australia about using income-based methods for properties with only resources, particularly inferred resources in Australia. But essentially you can apply the income-based method to anything at around scoping study level. So if you have resources at inferred level and you have a reasonable grasp of the other key inputs to the project, like metallurgical test work and infrastructure, you can apply the income-based method. And of course, the more advanced the property is, as you get towards PFS and feasibility study, that's where the income-based method, and particularly in construction and operation, that's where the income-based method really takes over. This is the main method, the more advanced your property gets. And as I mentioned before, this is where all the standard terms of NPV, so net present value, IRR, payback period, reserve tail, debt cover ratio, they all come from life of mine plans and discounted cash flow valuations. But I think it's important to realize that it's just another technique. You can apply any of the three techniques that I've talked about to valuing assets, and this is only one of them. This is an old adage that we use more or less in any area of work that we do, whether it's resource estimation, reserve estimation, pit slope assessment, rubbish in, rubbish out. The final product is actually only as good as the data going in, and the confidence and the quality of the data going in. I guess key questions you should ask excuse me. Key questions you should ask with if you're looking at evaluation is the quality of the resource and the reserve estimate. So how good is the data supporting the estimate of the grades and tons in the ground? Ultimately, that is the value of the property. You're trying to value the metal in the ground, and that's the foundation of any other study that gets built on top of that. So any infrastructure study, any mining study, they're all completely dependent on the resource and reserve estimate. So that is ultimately the key of understanding how good the valuation is. As I mentioned before, has the exploration expenditure added any value? And that's a bit more subjective, that question. The good thing about some of the other techniques apart from the income-based method is that you can factor your confidence of the underlying data into the valuation. So the more experienced the valuator, the more comfortable you'll be with putting in essentially fudge factors to bring the valuation up or the valuation down based on your understanding of the geology of the property and how good the data is. And subjectivity, particularly for early stage properties, the valuations are incredibly subjective. If they don't have a resource estimate, then it can be very difficult to not necessarily to derive a valuation, to estimate a valuation, but to defend the valuation if it gets audited. There's always a high degree of subjectivity in the valuation, and that is sometimes difficult to defend. So if you do get put in a position where you're trying to assess the validity of a value of an asset, particularly an early stage asset, ask yourself the question, who's valuing the property? How many similar valuations have they done in the past? And is the person doing the valuation independent from the transaction? That's it. Thank you.